Dawn Armstrong, wife and mother of 8, blogger, former hospital director, and former homeless person. Thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You have quite a storied past. How did you become homeless?
So I was born to teenage parents. My mother was 14 when she got married. She was 15 when she had my brother and 16 when she had me. And the marriage didn't last long. So my mom very quickly became a single mother, and drugs and alcohol became her way of coping. And so it left myself and my brother to essentially fend for ourselves. By the time I was 11, I left my mother's home and kind of bounced between my aunt's house and my grandmother's home till finally just I come from a very long line of broken men and women, so I just left. I packed up my stuff and I left, and I headed for the city. And I was just barely over 14.
Were you being abused at that time?
Yeah. Abuse was just something that was riddled throughout my family. Both my aunt and my grandmother and my mother were victims of domestic violence, and so they struggled to find their way. Therefore, it left us vulnerable.
What happened to you out on the streets?
Well, a lot of loneliness, a lot of heartbreak, constantly trying to figure out where you're gonna stay and what you're gonna do next. But I think it speaks pretty loudly that the fear of not having food and shelter and warmth just was of no consequence. I think the abuse spoke louder. So I left, and I was willing to struggle that hard just to get away.
At one point, you wound up at rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Describe how you got there and describe how you got out of it.
My rock bottom was actually when I was pregnant with my second child, and he passed away, and I had to learn some very hard lessons. I found myself pregnant when I was 15 for the first time. I gave birth when I was 16, and an unfortunate thing about being a 16-year-old is no matter how hard you work, no one will let you rent an apartment. No one will let you buy a car or turn on utilities. So you're kind of in no man's land, that you can have made some adult choices but don't have the adult privilege to take care and hold the consequences of those choices. That was really hard, and that was when homelessness became scary, and I had to turn to shelters, and I could no longer sleep in abandoned homes that in the middle of the winter and things like that. It was a rough life.
What did you do with the baby?
Well, I would try to stay with different friends. And, you know, with the baby, people were a little bit more compassionate and generous, but it really all hinged on how long they were willing to be charitable. And I had 2 years before I was 18. So, I mean, there's a part of the homeless population that whether it's they've been kicked out of their homes for various reasons. When I was homeless, a lot of the reasons that there were so many teenage homeless was if a girl got pregnant, sometimes her parents kicked her out, or if a child told their parent that they were gay, they were no longer welcome. And so a big part of the population that were my age were children that were kind of abandoned by their families and had nowhere to go.
And that's exactly where you were.
That's exactly where I was.
So did having the baby help you more than it hindered you?
No, I would say that being a young teenage single mother is not an ideal way to bring someone that needs love and affection and nurturing. Something that I had to learn to do, because that was not ever a gift I was given. And having a baby made people a little bit more open to helping you, but it was marginal, and that's why I ended up turning to the homeless shelter, because, and in fact, a lot of the homeless shelters that would have allowed me to stay were full. And so I found a homeless shelter that was for women, but you had to be 18 to stay there. And they broke the rules and let me in anyway.
There are people out there who would say about the homeless population, why don't they just go get a job? For someone who was homeless for as long as you were, what's wrong with that question?
Well, I had a job, but a job was not going to make me legal. You know, you have to be 18 to sign any legal document. Therefore, a certain part of the population, no matter how hard they work, their enemy is time. And the sad thing is, at 16, you want to fast forward to 18 just so that you can have some control over your life. I think for the homeless population that is above 18, I think their struggles have become so much bigger than that. Sometimes they had employment, but oftentimes it was medical expenses that had gotten so far out of control, it just ended.
It bankrupted.
Yeah, it bankrupted them, and they didn't have a way to provide for themselves and take care of this sick child. And so sometimes homeless parents, it comes from the selflessness that they've given up everything to make sure this child survives, even a roof over their head. I mean, and how do you choose? How do you choose between a sick child that needs medical care that is bankrupting you and the rest of your family's needs? There's no choice when you're a parent.
The imagery associated with homelessness is often somebody strung out on drugs, sleeping in the middle of the median or at Pioneer Park and that kind of thing. But what you have just described in terms of medical bankruptcy, people losing everything because of circumstances beyond their control, help me weigh which is the more prevalent in the homeless population.
Right. I think there's definitely a difference between vagrancy and homelessness. With at least, I lived in that world for 4 years, and there were people that wanted to get out of homelessness desperately, and that's the majority of the population. There is a small percentage of people that are vagrants, and it looks like they're large in numbers because when they all congregate in one area, it can be very intimidating. And that part is hard because unfortunately, there are some that are unwilling, even through aid, to change their circumstances. But for the majority, that's not what these proposed homeless shelters that they're hoping to create in the various communities throughout the Wasatch Front. That's who they're meant to help. I know for communities it can be very intimidating to think, to view Pioneer Park and think we're bringing that here. One of the problems with Pioneer Park is that the homeless shelter is so large, and having such a concentrated population, it's really hard for police to be able to support that great need. It's hard for social services to be able to support that great need. But if it were allowed to be dispersed throughout the communities, I think that our government entities would step up with helping with funding to help, increase police force where needed. And I think communities are able to step up in ways that it's manageable. I mean, I don't think it's possible for us to take care of the 1,100 bed facility. They've tried, and in fact, the reason and the need for this the request was actually by the homeless coalition, people that are homeless advocates, asking for essentially our public servants' help. They were saying, there is a real problem with crime down here, and it's hurting our homeless population. Can you please help us? And so it was actually the homeless advocacy groups that were calling for essentially the disbursement of the homeless population so they could be served better.
Now, did you go to the meeting in Draper?
I was not there, but I watched it through live feed. Somebody was live feeding it through Facebook.
Okay. You watched the emergency meeting in Draper when all the community came together to discuss what Mayor Troy Walker had done in suggesting those 2 sites for the homeless services centers.
Right.
When you saw the vitriol and the anger and the vehemence of people who are your neighbors, as a former homeless person, how did that make you feel?
Small. I think it made me worry a little bit about if homeless people were sitting in their living room watching our response. And it made me sad, because I can tell you that they already feel shame. It's probably one of the hardest things to do as a parent, is look down at your child and walk through the doors of a homeless shelter knowing that that is all you can give them. And it's not even yours to give in the moment. And so I think that homeless people do not need to be shamed into changing. I think they want to change. I think that they've fallen on hard times, and they would like someone that's willing to extend, their heart and their charity and their love and help them out of a very hard situation through sometimes something that was no fault of their own. And sometimes, there are people that have made choices, but even they deserve a second chance.
Utah has the reputation of being the most generous, most charitable state in the nation. From what you have observed on this issue, is that true in this case?
I think that Utah is full of good people with good hearts. I think that when you have not walked in someone else's shoes, it's easy to just see what's the surface level of a problem. And I think people have a right to be intimidated and scared. Like I said before, it is a scary thing to look at just the outside of the problem. It seems like, oh my goodness, the crime rates, what about our property values and things like that? And I understand those are valid concerns. And we're not trying to, and I'm not trying to say dismiss those concerns and who cares, just let's tackle this problem without a lot of thought being put into it. But I think what we are asking for is that there be room at the table for discussion, civil dialogue that will allow people to voice their concerns and allow people like Troy Walker and Mayor McAdams to address them. They want this to go well. And I think it reflects back to the character of those 2 gentlemen, that they were willing to take on the initiatives that aren't popular. It's really easy politically to take on the things that everybody's excited to do. But when it's something that is going to spark a lot of controversy, I think that they deserve an award for taking on a task so large and knowing that they're going to hit a lot of resistance because people are fearful. And it's justified fear. But I think if we start introducing that there's more to this than what they're seeing, I think people's hearts will open. I believe in the goodwill of our people in Utah. And I know that they are charitable, and I know that they're giving. And I know my neighbors in Draper are wonderful, loving people. I've spent the last 3 years there. I know they have good hearts. I just think that maybe in the moment, the way it was presented, it was more fear speaking. And but I know that if it's presented in the right way, people will step up.
As a former hospital director, you became very adept at marketing and strategic planning and that kind of thing. From what you have seen from Salt Lake County, have they done an adequate job in communicating to this community what these projects and what these centers really will be?
I think that that's a work in progress. I have not had a chance to meet with Ben McAdams yet. From what I followed on the stories, just online and on the news, because I followed this story since last September when when the homeless advocacy groups first started asking for help. I was really paying attention to what was going on. I know the solution is to, close the main Rio Grande area homeless shelter, and then redisperse that to 4 or 5 satellite facilities. But it hasn't been clear to me the execution of that plan and what that means. And I think that's why citizens are concerned. And maybe their plan was to get into the communities, get in front of them, and then give the details. But I think that
didn't work so well.
No, I think that emotions took over and people were resistant to hear what they had to say. Because I do know at the Draper meeting, they had brought staff there to answer questions. But I think
they never had a chance.
They never had a chance to explain what was going on, which was unfortunate.
So where do they go now in the campaign to educate the public about what these homeless service centers are actually going to be?
If it were me, and I would definitely hit the top 5 major concerns that top 5 or 10 major concerns that any community would have when they would bring a homeless shelter in and have the dynamics of their community change a little bit. I would look at, first and foremost, people's property values are of major concern. That's probably what I've heard the most. Yeah. I think that understanding that it's in a location that obviously has to be accessible for the homeless population. A lot of them need access to, metro transit. So they'll need access to, tracks or things like that so that they can get around.
Bus lines.
Right.
What else?
And so there needs to be a, for homeless shelters that are put in a community that has the potential to have some kind of mark or make some kind of mark on property values. Is there a plan for that? Will the county step up and help? I did read in an article that there were in this South Salt Lake area where they had determined the first site for this satellite homeless shelter or homeless service center, I think is what they're calling them. There was some properties that were adjoining, and I thought I read that for the property owners that were adjoining, that they had looked at the potential of maybe purchasing those properties so that they wouldn't be negatively affected. And I think that if the mayor comes to these communities with a plan like that, saying, I know your concern and this is what, this is the plan of action that we're going to take. And I think another thing is you have to address crime rates. You have to address vagrancy versus homelessness. And
drug addiction.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Who are we letting in? Which population will this serve? I know I've spoken with some of the people that live in Midvale, and there's a homeless center there. And at first no one wanted it. And I've spoken with several of the residents who are so glad that it's there now, because all of the residents have stepped up and rallied around this homeless shelter, and they've seen beautiful things happen. And that's what you want, is that the community feels respected and appreciated for the sacrifices that they're making, and the homeless population gets the help that they need. Mm.
I've read, and I think you wrote it, that true charity is not just going down and serving meals at the homeless shelter on Thanksgiving.
Right.
True charity is something more than that. What is it?
Right. I think people get charity and service confused. Service is going down and serving a meal and feeling that good feeling in your heart that you've done something for someone else. Charity requires a little bit more of our character. I call it a character nudge, where we have to kind of get outside our comfort zone and we feel a little bit of angst with the decision, because we have to look past what we think and instead open our hearts to someone in need.
Get out of your comfort zone.
Right, we do. We have to get outside ourselves and really open our hearts to something we may have not been comfortable doing before.
What is the relationship between charity and sacrifice?
I think they're very intertwined. I think charity is sacrifice, hands down. It's what we do. Well, it's kind of like when I give of myself to a degree where I feel myself change in a way that is unexpected, I think that's what sacrifice is. It's like, and you feel a little bit of, well, it's kind of like when I go to speaking engagements and I tell my story, and it's a painful story to tell. And I don't always feel like telling it. I don't feel like hurting again and kind of reopening old wounds. But I like the end. I like that it grants people permission to feel. I like that it helps them heal through things. And I think that's what sacrifice is doing something that may hurt you a little bit, but help you a lot, you know, and that's beautiful. That's the very nature of humanity, is we're always evolving into something more if we allow it to happen in our lives.
Pamela Atkinson is undoubtedly the face of homeless advocacy here in this community, and I have heard her on many, many occasions refer to the homeless population as our homeless friends. Mm-hmm. The only difference, she says, between her homeless friends and her circle of friends is that she doesn't always know her homeless friends' names. Mm-hmm. There's an awful lot to knowing their name, isn't there?
There is. I think when you give homelessness a face, all of a sudden the things that we assumed disappear. And I think sometimes we have to cast our eyes downward and see that there's a whole bunch of people that they want to be seen. They want to be a part of the community. They want to go on to do beautiful things. I know I did. Sometimes you have to rely on people's ability to see past your current circumstances and look at the potential if they just give a little bit, you know. And I think that if you walked into a homeless shelter and you sat down with people and you took a genuine interest in finding out who they are, I don't think there's one that you wouldn't want to help.
Why don't more people do that?
Well, I think that we get busy. We fill our lives with a lot of things, and sometimes we overlook the very great need that exists in our community. And it just requires us maybe having that charity, willing to have that sacrifice, to slow down a little bit, see those that are around you, and do a little bit more. Do a little bit more that hurts.
What did being homeless for all those years teach you about yourself and about life in general?
I think being homeless taught me, I don't know, to never look down on anyone, because you just don't know their story. I know when, and I say this in the article that I wrote, when we first kind of came into the homeless shelter, it was awkward, and no one really wanted to interact because we were all ashamed to be there. It's kind of, when I was homeless on my own, before I was in the shelter, before I lived at the homeless shelter, and I kind of was more just wherever I would land, wherever I could lay my head that night, whether it was a friend or an abandoned house or whatever. Then the problem seemed like it wasn't real. It was just, I'm really okay, and I can act like my life's normal, and the only time I have to worry about this is when it's time to eat or when it's time to sleep. When you're in a homeless shelter, everyone knows, and they see your need, and they see that you're not able to help yourself. That's very humbling. And I just will never look down on anyone in any circumstance. It taught me to have a true heart for people and to love beyond what's visible, because we just don't know. We just don't know what their struggles are. And I think when you have a chance to sit down and talk with people, your heart just changes towards them. Some of the stories I heard in the homeless shelter, it was amazing to me that these people had survived, and they're still fighting the great fight. They hadn't given up. They're not giving up on themselves, and they just really need the community to not give up on them either.
How did you finally break the cycle of homelessness in your own life?
I think that's the part that communities want to hear is charity's beautiful, service is wonderful, but there also needs to be accountability. The way my life changed, and when it was the pivotal moment that my life changed, was when I took that pointer finger and turned it around to my own chest and said, how can I start to make decisions in my life that reflect who I want to be and the opportunities I want to have? And when I was old enough to do that, I held myself accountable. I worked hard. I worked harder than anyone else. And when opportunities are given, that's the part of accountability that the homeless need to take on, is these opportunities are there, make the most of them, and then take a look at the decisions that you're making in your life. And if you need to change those things, you can't be afraid to look at yourself in the mirror and say, something has to change about my choices, something has to change about my character, something has to change about my work ethic. And when you're willing to do that, then the sky's the limit. You can have the most beautiful life. You can have safety, security. You can have an income that provides for your family. I mean, we all have to at some point be accountable for our contribution to our success and our contribution to giving back when it's our turn. And that's what I do today. I get to give back, and I get to see people and love them and serve them in a way that I was served. And I remember when someone, it was a former ecclesiastical leader, he helped me after my son died. And he helped me with a car. He owned a car dealership, and he gave me a car, no questions asked.
Wow.
And he said, I want you to succeed, and so this is my contribution to your success. And I looked at him and I said, but I have nothing to give you in return. And he said to me, yes, you do, because you can do it for the next person. He said, so I'll open this door for you, and you open this door for them.
And you've been giving back ever since.
Yep. And it's worth doing.
Contrast your life before with your life now.
It's a world of difference. I have 8 children, all of whom have grown up in a loving home where they're spoiled just enough. It's beautiful. In fact, a story that I often tell is my daughter, who's 7. She was 7 at the time. We have this video. It was we have our little assault vehicle when mothers have a lot of children. We have a Suburban. So in this, we have this tradition where we play a DVD until we hate it. And in this particular time, it was Letters to God. And if you've ever seen that movie, it's about a young boy who has cancer, and he doesn't understand everything that's going on in his life, so he writes he writes a letter to God, and he explains what his feelings are and things like that. So that sparked a lot of conversation. And my son that died is very alive in my children's life. We talk about him and things like that. And
How old was he when he died?
he was 3.5 months old when he died.
Okay, yeah.
And it was during the time that I was homeless, and I had no money to bury him. And so it was a very tender time in my life. And so it sparked a lot of questions about God and the nature of God. And she said to me, Mom, what do you think about God? Do you think all of the, I mean, she had a plethora of questions, but it sparked a lot of dialogue. And I went out, a couple days later, I went out to the mailbox, and there was a stack of mail. And on the top of it was this paper that was folded in half. And I took out the stack of paper, or the stack of mail, and I read it. And Sophia, my daughter, had written a letter to God saying that she missed her brother. And it said, "Dear Trey, I just wanted to say hi and that I miss you." And then she drew a little self-portrait, and it was, like little tears, and she said, "I'm 7 now." And when I looked at that little letter, and I thought about my life when I was 7 years old, and 10 years old, and 14 years old, and all of the hardships, to think that the way my daughter and her life and all of my children's lives, my goal as a parent was for them to never know the things that I watched, to never know the things that I witnessed or the abuse that I experienced. And my children never have. They've been loved and nurtured the whole way. People can and do change. They're not the sum of their mistakes, and they owe no debt to carrying abuse forward. We don't have to walk the path our parents did. We can blaze a new trail and go on and do beautiful things and have a really happy and fulfilled life.
If you could share one thought with those who seem to be wary of the homeless, what would it be?
It would be, sit at the table with us. Let's discuss. Let's see what we can do in our communities to calm the fears and address the needs. That there is room for us to discuss the worries. And there's room for us to serve the needy, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in this us versus them mentality when there's always been just us. It's always just us. And in our communities, it's our duty. It's our duty to do all that we can to serve those that are in less fortunate situations. And we can find a way that addresses concerns of crime. We can address vagrancy. We can address, drug situations and increased help with, public officials as far as, police officers, things like that. There's room at the table for all of these discussions. We just need people to show up willing to talk about this difficult subject. It's not going to be easy. It won't be an easy task, but it's not insurmountable. The challenges that exist are not insurmountable, and we can tackle this because we've got a lot of really brilliant people in these communities that have a lot of skills to bring to the table. And if they come willing to bring their own ideas, and I don't think concerns are always, concerns are never a problem, but can you bring your ideas too? Bring your ideas about what you think we can do, locations that we can use, or services that we can provide. And the beautiful thing is there are so many people willing to help. The article that I wrote, it's kind of went viral. I've gotten thousands of letters of people that have said, I didn't know what I didn't know. And that part's beautiful because now that they see a face, they are so much more willing to help once they see, oh my goodness, there is a real need and I had no idea that this was going on. I think people just, they don't know who they're rejecting. They don't realize, you know, I think putting a face to homelessness brings back the humanity of the giver.
Dawn Armstrong, wife and mother of 8, blogger, former hospital director, and former homeless person. Thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Thank you so much. Take care.